Al Jazeera Podcasts.
There were many moments where I passed their bedside and I had this very sad thought that I thought death would be more merciful for them.
That's pediatric intensive care doctor Tanya Haj-Hassan. You may have seen or heard of her before. She's been on the front lines in Gaza treating patients. Since October the 7th, 2023, more than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed. And according to Gaza's Ministry of Health, at least 16,400 of them are children, more than 11,000 of them women. Dr. Tanya has worked tirelessly to help people in Gaza, and I want to know, in the face of such despair, what drives her and what keeps her going. I'm Samantha Johnson, and this is Now You Know, a new series from Al Jazeera dedicated to amplifying women's voices, stories, and at times, some pretty uncomfortable topics. This is a safe space where we go all in, so by the end of each episode, you can say, "Now I know." Today, October the 7th, marks 1 year since Israel's war on Gaza began. The UN has described the situation as unimaginable, overwhelmingly due to the recurring failures by the Israeli military to comply with the rules of war. Nearly 500 healthcare workers have been killed. Others have been detained or tortured. And one doctor who spent a lot of time in Gaza and is one of the most passionate voices about the Palestinians and the war is Dr. Tanya Haj-Hassan. So, Dr. Tanya, I cannot thank you enough for joining us on Now You Know.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I suppose it's kind of difficult to know where to start. So I'm going to just start like this. Why do you do what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I guess for your viewers, I'm a pediatric doctor. So my specialty is caring for children. My subspecialty within caring for children is caring for the sickest children. I'm a pediatric intensive care doctor. And I think I reflect back on all the things that enabled me to get where I am. And I think about all the children everywhere in the world that don't have those opportunities for various reasons. And I think that's what got me into this to start with. So I got involved in Doctors Without Borders and a few other NGOs as well. And I started working abroad, providing medical care and training in different settings. One of those settings was the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This is over 10 years ago now. And I think in this particular incident, why do I do what I do? It's because I recognize this deep injustice that didn't start in October, but has been going on now for almost 18 years in terms of the siege on Gaza, and over 76 years in terms of the occupation in general. And I feel like we all have a responsibility when we recognize injustice to be. And when we recognize, particularly as a healthcare worker, when we recognize the cause of the disease in a population, that we work on prevention. And prevention in this case runs far deeper than medical interventions. Prevention in this case is, an immediate ceasefire. It's lifting of the siege. It is an end to the occupation, so that the population itself can live with the full rights that they deserve, like every other person on this planet.
You've been going back and forth to Gaza for the past 10 years. When did you first go back to Gaza after October the 7th?
March of this year, yeah. I tried to go prior, in fact, and I was on a couple of the plans for emergency medical teams that were going in. One of the teams I was meant to go in, just the day we were being briefed, we heard that the group that preceded us, that we were going to be replacing, was actually bombed in their place of accommodation, despite the area being deconflicted. And so that NGO actually canceled the next mission. And I had to get placed on another emergency medical team. It's actually incredibly difficult to go as a humanitarian worker, more difficult than any other setting I've been in. And I've worked in so many settings, but there's so many steps to being able to go beyond security.
Can you tell us about some of the children that you've treated in Gaza as well?
So when I was in Gaza, I was mainly based in the emergency department and the intensive care unit, and I would check on children in the pediatric unit. So I'll start with the pediatric unit. The pediatric unit was, packed. Little rooms with like multiple children in one cot. There were children in the hallways, and these were all children who were admitted for medical reasons. So these aren't children who have been hit by bombs or injured in the war. These are children who are there because they are sick, because they are extremely unwell, and we don't talk about that often enough in the media. But people in Gaza are very ill. They're very, very ill. My adult colleagues tell me that they're have had back-to-back infections now for 10 months. And so the same is true for children who are even more vulnerable. And so the hospitals were packed. Because so many of the hospitals in Gaza have been destroyed, it meant that smaller hospitals like the one I was based at were receiving a disproportionately large number of patients. And many children with chronic diseases, children that had cerebral palsy or diabetes or liver disease, were in the hospital extremely unwell because they weren't able to control their chronic diseases under the circumstances. So that's the pediatric unit. In and around the pediatric unit, I can tell you about a little girl who was hit in a bombardment and part of her hand was gone, and she was extremely depressed. And she was there with a distant relative who was caring for her because her parents couldn't be there with her. And I tried to visit her when I could, but she was sort of giving up on life and would say that frequently. There was another little girl who was living in the hospital with her parents. She had been injured but had recovered. All of her siblings were killed in the same airstrike. And she was a very positive, bubbly little girl who always came around and said hello. They had been living in the hospital for months. And she would want to walk around as I rounded on patients in the pediatric unit. Then there is the intensive care unit. An intensive care unit is an adult intensive care unit in a hospital like the hospital I was based at would normally be filled with adult patients. This particular ICU is an adult ICU. However, all but one of the patients in the unit while I was there were children. And that tells you something about the disproportionate impact that this assault is having on children. They were mostly traumatically injured children. Several of them had severe brain damage, would probably never walk, talk again if they were to survive at all.
You just said they might not function properly ever again. Where's the aftercare? Or if there is any aftercare, what happens to these children?
There were many moments where I passed their bedside and I had this very sad thought that I thought death would be more merciful for them, because I would think about how many family members they lost and the fact that they would be so disabled the rest of their life, and not knowing what kind of opportunities they would have for rehab, for housing, for safety, for support, for guardianship, for love. And that last point, probably don't need to worry about at all in a place like Gaza, because people take care of each other so well. Tell you a story of another little boy who's I think about 10 years old, had been bombed in his car with his family when they were trying to flee from the north to the south. And he had severe fractures to his leg, to the point where they had metal bars and external fixator that were holding the bones in place. And he was in the hospital in a wheelchair with a bunch of young men that hung out with him. And I remember asking if they were his brothers, and he said no. And I was like, are they your cousins? And he said, no. And I said, who are they? He said, they're my friends. And I looked at the guys thinking, are you really his friends? You're at least 10 years older than this child. And they said, yeah, we're his friends. And I said, where are your parents? And he said, in the north. And one of the men shook his head and he said, like, he looked at me and shook his head. And then as I was walking away later, he said that the child's parents had been killed. And in fact, his family had been killed and he had survived the attack, but nobody had the heart to tell him. So he thought his family were still trapped in the north. And he lived in the hospital, receiving care for this complex fracture. And strangers, other injured people, other displaced people in the hospital were caring for him. So these so-called friends of his who fed him, cared for him, apparently were just, what's the phrase? Just good people in the community.
The family,
and then
they've built it. It seems like they've built another family.
They have. And then there's the emergency department. And I leave the emergency department to last because that was certainly the most traumatic place, because children in the emergency department are traumatized. Children in the emergency department. First of all, the emergency department is not an environment that any human should have to see or witnessed. And to think of a child seeing those things at this stage, I think about my non-medical friends and what standing in an emergency department like that might do to them. Heck, I think about my medical colleagues who were there, grown adults who were trained and who've been doing this since they qualified, who say that these images haunt them in their dreams. Like it's horrific. Mass casualty after mass casualty, entire families coming in maimed, dismembered, fighting for their lives. And I just want to be clear, Sam, the worst cases, we don't even see them. The children that are already dead get taken straight to the morgue area. We don't even see them. The ones who are conscious are witnessing these scenes, are seeing members of their family, members of their community being brought in the same attack, maimed, dismembered, traumatic amputations. It's really horrific to see for anybody. And I can't think of the impact that these scenes would have on any child. The number of children that would come in just shaking, like their bodies just shaking, and they just have this pupils dilated, shaking, just staring around and mute. They say nothing and they just look at the carnage around them. Really, really horrific. And there are no beds. The emergency department was always full, so the children would be sitting on the floor. If they were lucky and their mother had survived the attack, she would be clinging onto them for dear life.
Can you explain how it's more difficult going in as a volunteer?
A lot of organizations have been deterred from sending people in because time and time again, this process of so-called deconfliction, where organizations communicate with Israeli authorities about their coordinates, their movements, that are supposed to ensure that they're not bombed, that they don't end up a target. That mechanism has failed time and time and time again. You remember the World Central Kitchen being bombed in their vehicle. There have been multiple times that UN vehicles have been hit. Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, has been hit multiple times, both in terms of their accommodation and their vehicles as they're moving from point A to point B. And it's usually not that they're caught in crossfire. So organizations obviously feel deterred. And so that's the first reason. So they send in small groups. These groups have to be extensively coordinated because there is no safety. Every single person on the group has to be approved to go in by Israeli authorities. And this process, for many of my colleagues, they've been rejected despite having been in before. It's just incredibly difficult. And particularly after the closure of the Rafah crossing, it also means that when you do go in, you're crossing through Israel and you're allowed one single bag of personal belongings, what you need for the month that you're there. So you can't take in the equipment that you need to care for patients.
I just want to pick up on a point that you just said about it being difficult for people to get in, and obviously just how difficult the conditions are. But it's the fact that medics, people doing your job or what you're doing, you're being targeted. Some of your colleagues have been detained, tortured, and I know that some have been killed as well. How do you carry on?
Nothing we experience comes close to what our Palestinian colleagues are experiencing, the Palestinian healthcare workers. I talk about deconfliction and this concern about security going in with an organization. Palestinian healthcare workers who are there feel they have a target on their back. I've heard from multiple colleagues that they worry about identifying as a healthcare worker or about going out in the open wearing scrubs or anything that would identify them as a healthcare worker. And many who've been bombed in their homes, who've been bombed while they're working at the hospital. There are 2 MSF doctors that were killed while at the hospital. And it's we're seeing this time and time again that healthcare workers are being killed with impunity. We've heard report after report of torture of these healthcare workers who are taken from their homes, from the hospitals where they're working by Israeli forces, are detained, are taken from prison to prison within Israel. And those who are released describe extreme levels of physical, psychological, and even sexual torture. And there have been a number of them that have been killed while in detention. And usually, I'm not obviously a human rights lawyer. I don't have any sense of experience in international humanitarian law, but as far as I'm aware, when anyone is detained, they have a right, not only a right, that there has to be an independent body that checks on their well-being. And in these cases, for example, the ICRC would often go in, confirm that missing healthcare workers actually in Israeli detention, would know their whereabouts, would know their medical condition. And that's just not happening. Families don't know where their loved ones are.
Have you ever felt threatened? Like you could be next, you could be the next medic detained?
Again, I'm not Palestinian, and I know that sounds terrible, but what Palestinians experience in terms of targeting, in terms of impunity when they're targeted, is very exceptional. It's not just exceptional compared to us; it's exceptional globally. What we have allowed to happen in Gaza, in the West Bank. We've made an exception for international humanitarian law. We've made an exception in terms of war crimes. We've made an exception in terms of UN resolutions. I mean, in the past, you'd hear that a hospital was targeted in a war and you would shudder. Virtually every hospital in Gaza has been impacted in one way or another, with many of them bombed directly. Same thing is true of schools and mosques and water supply sources. And, time and time again, that slippery slope, we just keep sliding down this slippery slope. And it's very frightening because what happens in Palestine will happen everywhere else in the world. We're setting a new precedent. And it is very concerning. So no, I don't usually worry about being detained or killed. All of those things are very possible. But one, I haven't committed a crime. And because I haven't committed a crime, I still believe in an international and local legal system that will not find me guilty of a crime I didn't commit. Whereas that, unfortunately, is not true for Palestinians who are not allowed that recourse of justice.
If I may, I'd like to pivot to your experience, your personal experience as a female doctor in Gaza. Can you just tell us what that's like?
My gender didn't really factor into it for me personally. I don't think it factored to me in terms of personal safety as a volunteer worker. What did factor in, obviously, from a being a female standpoint, is reflecting on all the considerations that I suspect women in Gaza, or I know women in Gaza are worrying about all the time. What will I do while I'm there? At least we had access to a bathroom, but what will I do when I'm there in terms of personal hygiene? What will I do while I'm there for menstrual cycle and products? And I could bring those things in. I had access to a bathroom. We didn't have access to a shower, but we could sort of bucket bathe in the bathroom. Many of my colleagues, nurses, physicians working in the hospital with me, my female colleagues, were living in tents. And when we asked them what they wanted, they said they wanted sanitary pads. Could you bring us pads? So I packed a whole bunch of pads with me. This was back when the Egyptian crossing was open. My suitcases were filled with pads. Now people are asking for soap because soap is not being let in. So they want soap and shampoo. And so, yeah, I can't imagine being a female living in Gaza right now. In terms of me, what was it like for me as a healthcare worker generally going to Gaza? I had been very agitated for many months prior to going. I think watching this all unfold from a distance, knowing that my colleagues, who I respect very much, who I love very much, were going through a genocide, and I was on the outside, unable to directly support them or provide solidarity, was very difficult. So I think the most calm that I felt in several months was the moment we crossed over and saw that I Love Gaza sign, which has now been destroyed. But seeing that I Love Gaza sign and thinking, thank God I'm finally here. I don't know what I'll be able to achieve with limited resources and the sheer number of patients, but at least I can provide moral solidarity to both my colleagues and the patients.
Dr. Tanya, you've been incredibly passionate and incredibly vocal about what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza right now, and of course about your colleagues and other medics as well. The war has become an election issue in the US, where Americans are going to vote in November. Now, at the Democratic National Convention in August, you spoke about Palestinian rights, and your account and your description of what's going on has moved people to tears, to the point where someone had to leave the stage.
He was lying in his bed and mumbling because it was so difficult to talk. And he kept saying, I got really close to him and he said, I wish I had died too. And I said, what? And he said, I think my entire family has gone to heaven. Or it's not my entire family. His exact words were something effective. Everybody I love is now in heaven. I don't want to be here anymore. That is one of so many stories. I'm so sorry, Leila, but I think people need to hear this. I'm giving you the story of one child.
Do you feel that the international community have let the children of Gaza down?
I think the Palestinian people have been let down. The Palestinian people have been let down for an entire year of genocidal violence almost now. 17 years of siege, 76 years of occupation. The fact that, if you look back through history and you see UN resolution after UN resolution after international outcry and no response, just full impunity, them living in ever worsening conditions, it's shocking. It's really shocking. So yeah, I do think we have let Palestinian people down, for sure. And I know they feel that way too, because time and time again, I receive messages from my colleagues saying things to the effect of, the whole world has abandoned us. We feel like the whole world has come together to eliminate us. These are almost direct quotes. I don't blame them. I think that would be my perspective too. If I knew what was happening, if I was there and saw the mass graves, people being buried in mass graves. Sam, there are over 20,000 children in Gaza who are missing. These are reports by Save the Children and other very credible organizations. And do you know what I mean by missing? Can you imagine where they might be?
I can't.
Under the rubble, in mass graves, maimed beyond recognition so that nobody can identify them and know, what the child's identity is. Some of them have been detained, children under the age of 18, under the age of 16, who've been detained by Israeli forces, who have disappeared. These are all, can you imagine? These children are missing. Children who've been separated by their families in the chaos of the violence. These are all explanations, by the way, that were given by these organizations for these children that they are missing. They're presuming that they're either under the rubble or buried in mass graves, unidentified. This is 2024, Sam. We're talking mass graves with unidentified children.
Have you ever felt like giving up?
I think people have suggested that I give up. Friends and family have just said, it's not making a difference. Like, why are you killing yourself? With advocacy work and trying to go back, and it's not making a difference. You can tell, look, if the UN can't make a difference, what good is it going to do? They might be right. I don't know if anything we're doing is making a difference. But I don't think I'd be able to live with myself if I wasn't doing something. And I've spoken with a lot of colleagues who've been to Gaza and who feel the same way I do. When we're not actively doing something, it's really unbearable because you just feel like you're complicit in, modern day genocide. And I don't have children. One day, if I do, I'll be able to tell them when they're reading about this in their history books that I was doing something when it was happening in real time.
Dr. Tanya, thank you. I really, really, really do appreciate you for giving us your story, your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So now you know why people like Dr. Tanya Haj-Hassan continue to do the work they do. Healthcare workers are being kidnapped, detained, tortured, and in some cases killed while trying to save men, women, and children caught in war. So with that, I just want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Tanya for joining me today. And of course, a special thank you to you for listening and watching Now You Know.